I need to tell you something I got wrong for almost a year after it ended. I kept waiting to feel like myself again. Not better. Not healed. Just myself. The version of me that existed before him. I thought that person was still in there somewhere, waiting. And all I had to do was survive long enough. And he'd come back online. Like nothing had happened. And I want to be honest with you right now. At the start. Before I get into any of this. That never happened. And I spent months thinking that meant I was doing something wrong. I'm 48 years old. I spent 12 years in hospice care before I burned out completely. And I want to explain why that matters here, because it's not a random detail. It's the whole reason I noticed what I'm about to tell you. When you sit with people who are dying, you learn something most people never have to learn until it's forced on them. You don't go back. Not to who you were before you watched someone you loved stop breathing in front of you. Not to who you were before you held a stranger's hand while they died alone because their family couldn't make it in time. People kept telling me, after I left that job, "You'll bounce back. You'll feel normal again." And I remember thinking, quietly to myself, I don't think that's what's happening to me. I think I'm becoming something else. And I didn't have language for what that something else was. Not yet. So when I started reading the messages people send me, and I read a lot of them, more than you'd think, I noticed the exact same sentence showing up. Over and over. From people who had just gotten out of relationships with someone who spent months or years making them disappear. Different words, same shape. I keep waiting to feel like myself again, but some part of me knows I'm not going back to who I was before him. I just don't know yet who I'm turning into. And underneath that, almost every time, a second layer. Everyone keeps saying I'll heal, I'll move on. But that's not what this feels like. It feels like I'm becoming someone I've never met. Stay with me here, because I think we've been asking the wrong question this whole time. We keep asking, how do I get back to normal? And I want to suggest something that might be uncomfortable at first. That question doesn't have an answer because it's the wrong question. The real question, the one nobody hands you a script for, is who are you becoming now? Not who you were. Who you're turning into. Because of what you survived and how you're processing it, and Carl Jung, of all people, mapped this exact process. Not in some vague, comforting, self-help way. Specifically, with a name. With a myth behind it that's honestly a little unsettling once you sit with it. I want to walk through this slowly because I think it matters, and I don't think it's talked about the way it should be. Before I keep going, I want to pause for 1 second. If this is the kind of conversation you needed tonight, the one that doesn't just tell you you'll be fine, but actually tries to name what's happening to you, hit subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this, not surface-level comfort. The real architecture underneath it. I have a lot more of these conversations in me, and I'd rather you didn't miss them. Okay, so here's where I have to back up because I need you to understand where I was standing before any of this made sense to me. For most of my adult life, I believed sensitivity was a weakness I needed to manage, not a thing I needed to understand. I absorbed everyone's pain. My patients, their families, eventually my own marriage. And I called that strength. I thought, this is who I am. I feel everything. I carry everyone. That's my role. And then I burned out so completely that I couldn't get out of bed for 3 weeks. My marriage ended not long after, and I remember lying on my apartment floor at 2 in the morning, not dramatically, just literally on the floor because the couch felt too far away, thinking, I don't know who I am if I'm not the person who holds everyone else's pain. That was the version of me before, secure in a role, secure in a belief. That feeling everything for everyone else was the whole of who I was. That was my zone of comfort, if you can call something that exhausting a comfort. It was familiar, and familiar felt safe, even when it was killing me slowly. But something didn't sit right. A friend, a former colleague from the hospice actually, handed me a book called Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and said almost offhand, "You need to read this, not because it'll fix you, but because I think you'll recognize yourself in it." And I didn't want to. I want to be honest about that. I didn't want another thing to process. I was so tired of processing things, but there was a question underneath my exhaustion that wouldn't leave me alone. If feeling everything for everyone else broke me, was the feeling itself the problem? Or was it something else? Something I was doing wrong with the feeling? I needed to know. Not out of curiosity, out of something closer to desperation. That need is the same one I hear in every message from someone who just left a relationship with a narcissist. It's not, "How do I feel better?" It's more specific and more urgent than that. It's, "If I'm not going back to who I was, then what happens to me now? Because I can't just float in this unknown version of myself indefinitely. I need to know what I'm becoming. Because right now, it feels like nothing. Like I disappeared and no one's coming to replace me. That's not a small ache. That's the kind of question that keeps you up at 3 in the morning scrolling through your phone looking for someone, anyone who can tell you it means something. So I crossed a line I didn't expect to cross. I started reading Jung obsessively, White. Not as research, not as a project, but because I needed an answer. And I was willing to go looking for it in strange places. And here's where it gets specific, because I don't want to leave you with vague comfort. I want to give you the actual thing I found. In 1951, Jung wrote something that I had to read twice, and I mean that literally. I put the book down and picked it back up, because I didn't believe what I'd just read the first time. He was drawing on an old Greek myth, the myth of Chiron. And I want to tell you the myth first because it's strange and visual, and I think it'll stay with you the way it stayed with me. Chiron was a centaur. Half man, half horse, but unlike every other centaur in Greek mythology, who were mostly chaotic, violent creatures, Chiron was wise, gentle, a teacher of gods and heroes. He trained Achilles, he trained Jason, he trained physicians in the art of healing. And here's the detail that matters. Chiron was immortal. He could not die, and one day, by accident, during a chaotic skirmish, Hercules, fired an arrow that had been dipped in the blood of the Hydra, a poison so lethal that nothing could survive it. And that arrow struck Chiron. Now an ordinary being would have died instantly, but Chiron was immortal, so the poison didn't kill him. It just stayed. Forever. An unhealable wound on an immortal being who could not escape it by dying and could not resolve it by healing. He was stuck holding it, permanently. And this is the part that undid something in me. Chiron didn't become bitter. He didn't become a lesser version of himself, hollowed out by a wound he couldn't shake. He became the greatest healer in Greek mythology. The word Chiron is actually the root of the word surgeon, care, hand, and the practice of healing with the hands. His wound didn't disqualify him from healing others. It's the reason he could. He understood something about pain that no untested healer could ever access, because he was living inside an unresolved wound every single day, and that proximity to his own suffering became a kind of vision. Jung took that myth and built an entire clinical concept out of it. He called it the wounded healer. And here's the exact line. I want to read it to you because I don't want to paraphrase something this precise. It is his own hurt that gives a measure of his power to heal. This, and nothing else, is the meaning of the Greek myth of the wounded physician. And then, even more directly, the doctor is effective only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded healer heals. Read that again. Only the wounded healer heals. Not the person who avoided the wound. Not the person who was lucky enough to skip it. The one who was struck by it and is still, in some sense, carrying it. I have to be honest with you about something right here, because I think it matters more than getting straight to the encouraging part. This isn't a warm blanket of a concept. It's actually a little disturbing if you sit with it long enough, because it means the wound doesn't go away. Chiron doesn't get healed at the end of the myth and ride off having learned his lesson. He carries it until the day, much later, when he willingly gives up his immortality just to be free of the pain, trading his own endless life so Prometheus could be freed instead. The wound was permanent. What changed wasn't the wound. What changed was what the wound made possible in him while he carried it. I think that's the piece almost nobody tells survivors of narcissistic abuse. Not because people are being cruel, because it's genuinely hard to say out loud without sounding like you're minimizing what happened. But here it is anyway. The wound you're carrying right now. The disorientation. The hypervigilance. The way you flinch at things that used to feel normal. That might not be something to eliminate. It might be something to understand. I want to slow down here, because I know how that can land wrong, and I need to be careful with it. I am not saying the relationship was good for you. I am not saying you should be grateful it happened. That's not what Jung is arguing, and it's not what I'm arguing. What I'm saying, what the whole architecture of this idea rests on, is a very specific distinction. There's a difference between a wound that stays raw because it was never actually faced, and a wound that's been looked at directly, felt all the way through, and integrated into who you are now. The first kind just hurts, indefinitely, and it can genuinely make your life smaller. The second kind still hurts. Chiron's wound never stopped hurting. But it also generates something. Perception, depth, an ability to recognize things in others that people who were never wounded simply can't see because they've never had to look that closely at pain. That distinction is everything. And I don't think I can just tell you that and move on, because the next question is obvious. How do you know which one you're carrying? How do you know if your hypervigilance is the raw, unprocessed wound still bleeding, or if it's turning into something else? This is where I have to admit I got stuck for a long time in my own version of this. After the burnout, after the divorce, I spent close to 2 years reading Jung at night in an apartment that still had unopened boxes from the move, because I couldn't bring myself to finish unpacking a life I wasn't sure I wanted to live in. And I kept hitting a wall. I understood the concept intellectually. Wounded healer, Chiron, the myth. Fine. But I didn't know if it applied to me, or if I was just telling myself a nice story to avoid admitting I was still broken. There's a difference between healing and telling yourself a flattering story about your pain, and for a long time I genuinely could not tell which one I was doing. There was a stretch, maybe 8 months in, where I actually stopped reading altogether. I remember telling a friend, half joking, half not, I think I'm using Jung to avoid dealing with my actual life. And there was truth in that. It's a real risk, and I want to name it instead of skipping past it, because if you're in the middle of processing something like this, you might hit the same wall. You can turn insight into a hiding place. You can read about the wounded healer archetype and feel like you're doing the work, when really you're just intellectualizing so you don't have to feel the actual grief underneath it. I knew the myth of Chiron better than I knew how to sit quietly in my own apartment without reaching for a book to numb the silence. That's not growth. That's just a more sophisticated form of avoidance, and I had to catch myself doing it before anything real could move. What broke the stall, honestly, was one of my old hospice patients. Well, Not a patient anymore. Her daughter, who I'd stayed in touch with. She called me out of nowhere, maybe a year after her mother passed, just to check in. And somewhere in that conversation, she said something like, "You always knew what to say to her, even in the hardest moments. Do you still have that, or did you lose it when you left?" And I didn't have an answer. I sat with the phone still in my hand for a long time after we hung up, actually frightened by the question, because I genuinely didn't know. Had I lost the thing that made me useful in a room with someone dying? Or was it still there, just untested, waiting for a place to show up again? I didn't like not knowing. That uncertainty sat in my chest for weeks. I remember specifically, this was maybe 14 months after I left hospice work. Sitting in my car outside a grocery store. Engine off. Not going in yet, because I'd just had a conversation with a woman in the parking lot whose husband was clearly, obviously, cruelly manipulating her in front of me, disguised as a joke, the kind of comment that's designed to be deniable. And I noticed it instantly. Not because I was looking for it. It just landed on me. Immediately. The way you notice a smell you weren't expecting. And I sat in that car afterward thinking, I would not have caught that a few years ago. I would have laughed along with everyone else. Something in me is different now. And I didn't know yet if that was a gift or if it was just scar tissue making me suspicious of everyone. That's the exact fork in the road I hear from survivors constantly. And I think it's the most important thing in this entire video. So I want to give you the actual clinical distinction, not just my own parking lot story. There's a difference between dysfunctional hypervigilance and calibrated perception. Dysfunctional hypervigilance is reacting to threats that are no longer there. Seeing manipulation in a partner who has never given you a reason to, treating every disagreement like the opening move of the same old war, staying braced for an attack that isn't coming anymore. That version doesn't protect you. It isolates you. It keeps the old relationship alive inside your nervous system long after the person is gone. Calibrated perception is different. It's recognizing real patterns, the specific tells, the specific tactics, the specific tone shifts that you missed before because you'd never had to learn that language. It's not suspicion of everyone. It's precision about the exact signals that led you into that relationship in the first place. One survivor described this so clearly it stopped me cold when I first read it. She said, the moment she recognized her own growth wasn't when she felt healed. It was when she noticed she could spot manipulation in seconds. The same tactics that had taken her months to even suspect the first time. She said that new, instant recognition was uncomfortable. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like carrying a strange new sense she hadn't asked for. But she said it plainly. That wasn't damage. That was a capability she didn't have before. I think about that a lot because it maps almost exactly onto something a hospice patient once said to me years ago that I never fully understood until now. She was in her final weeks and she told me, "You know, the people who scare me the most aren't the ones who are angry about dying. It's the ones who never let themselves feel anything real their whole life. They're the ones with nothing to work with at the end." I didn't understand what she meant back then. I think I do now. The wound gives you something to work with. Untested people don't have that material. But here's where I have to be careful, because this is exactly the point where it would be easy to turn this into empty encouragement, and I don't want to do that to you. Because there is a real, specific, uncomfortable cost to what I'm describing. And if I don't name it, I think I'm lying to you by omission. This isn't just a science topic to me. When I was 26 years into hearing people's last words, I started noticing patterns in what dying people regretted, and almost none of it was about achievement. It was almost always about the moments they didn't let themselves feel something real, out of fear of what it would cost them. I used to think that was just a hospice observation. Now I think it's the same lesson, from a different direction. The cost is this. You don't get to go back to being the person who didn't know. That sounds obvious when I say it out loud, but I don't think most people actually sit with what it means. The version of you before this relationship, the one who trusted easily, who took people's kindness at face value, who didn't scan a room for warning signs. That person is not waiting for you on the other side of healing. She's gone, not destroyed. Gone, the way a season ends. You are never getting back the specific innocence of not knowing what you now know. That's the actual price, not a metaphor. A real, permanent closing of a door you didn't choose to walk through and can't walk back out of, even on the days you desperately want to. I sat with this for a long time in my own life, and I want to tell you honestly, there were nights I wanted the old version of myself back so badly it physically hurt. The version who hadn't watched 300 people die, who still believed exhaustion was proof of love, who hadn't learned the hard way what it costs to give everyone else your entire nervous system and call it compassion. That person is gone. I am not becoming him again. I used to think that was purely a loss. I don't think that anymore. But I also refuse to pretend it doesn't ache. It does. It should. If it didn't ache, it would mean you never actually valued who you were before, and that's not true either. There's a specific kind of grief that nobody warns you about here, and I think it deserves its own name instead of getting folded into healing is hard. It's the grief of closing a door on a version of yourself you can still remember clearly. Not a stranger, not someone you've forgotten, but someone whose voice you can still hear in your own head, whose habits you catch yourself slipping back into on tired days. You're not grieving someone abstract, you're grieving someone specific, someone who used to answer the phone a certain way, who used to believe certain things about love without question, who didn't flinch at gestures that now make you scan a room. Mourning a person who is still, in some sense, you, just not accessible anymore. That's a strange, lonely kind of loss, and I don't think it gets talked about with the seriousness it deserves. This is exactly why the research on this matters to me. Not as decoration, but because it tells me I wasn't inventing a private coping story. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun built an entire empirical model around this exact phenomenon. They called it post-traumatic growth, and their research, published in Psychological Inquiry in 2004, building on work going back to 1996, identifies 5 specific, measurable domains where people change after severe trauma. A new personal strength they didn't have before, a genuine openness to new possibilities they wouldn't have considered, deeper and more honest relationships, a sharpened appreciation for being alive at all, and often a real shift in what they find spiritually or existentially true. Their measurement tool, the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory, has been cited in academic research more than 7,000 times. I want to say that number again because I think it matters. 7,000 citations. This is not a comforting rumor therapists tell people to make them feel better. This is one of the most replicated, most measured phenomena in trauma psychology. And I need to stop here and say something directly because I know exactly what the skeptical part of your brain might be doing right now, and I respect that skepticism, so let me meet it head on. Someone might be thinking, this is just romanticizing abuse, just telling people they should be grateful for what happened to them. I want to be unambiguous. That is not what this is. And if that's what you heard, I said it wrong. The Tedeschi and Calhoun model is explicit on this point. Growth does not erase damage. The positive and the negative coexist in the same person at the same time. Nobody credible is saying the survivor should thank the person who hurt them. What the research actually shows is that real processing of trauma, not burying it, not glorifying it, actually facing it, is what produces new capacity. That's categorically different from the abuse itself being good. The abuse was not good. What can come after if you do the work is real. Those are two separate facts, and you're allowed to hold both without one canceling the other. And there's a second thing I want to meet directly, because I've heard it too, that what we're calling growth is really just a nicer name for becoming paranoid and untrusting. I understand why that objection exists, because from the outside, hypervigilance and calibrated perception can look identical. But clinically, they're not the same thing. And the difference isn't philosophical, it's functional. The survivor who actually did the work doesn't become suspicious of everyone equally. They become specifically, precisely accurate about the exact signals that led them into that relationship the first time. That's not fear running the show. That's information the body earned the hard way, now actually usable. Now here's something I have to bring back, because I don't think I can leave this conversation without closing the loop I opened at the start. Remember the trauma bonding. Remember why leaving didn't feel like relief. Estimates put trauma bonding as affecting roughly 80% of abuse survivors, and it explains something that confuses almost everyone who gets out of a relationship like this. Why does leaving feel like disorientation instead of freedom? Why did I feel worse for months, not better? The answer is that your nervous system was calibrated over months or years to a specific dynamic. The highs, the crumbs of affection, the anxiety, the relief when things were briefly okay. When that dynamic disappears, your body doesn't instantly recalibrate. It's still bracing for a rhythm that no longer exists. That disorientation you might be feeling right now isn't proof you're broken or that you miss him. It's your nervous system in the middle of recalibrating to a world that no longer requires that bracing. That process is frequently reported to continue for 2 to 5 years. Not weeks. Years. If you are still in the middle of that and wondering why you don't feel healed yet, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not behind schedule. You are exactly where the actual timeline says you'd be. I think about my own path through this the same way now. I didn't feel like a different, better version of myself in a tidy 6-month window after I left hospice care. It took years. There were entire stretches where I thought the reading, the reflection, all of it wasn't doing anything. And then, slowly, without a specific moment I can point to, I noticed I was reacting to things differently. I noticed I could sit with someone else's pain now without drowning in it, the way I used to. I noticed I could tell the difference between someone who needed me to fix something and someone who just needed to be witnessed. A distinction I never had before, 12 years into a caregiving profession. That took years to arrive. Not because I was doing it wrong, because that's how long real recalibration takes. So let's come back to where we started, because I think you deserve the honest version of the answer now, not the comforting shortcut. You asked, or the version of you that sent me that message asked, am I ever going to feel like myself again? And I want to give you the real answer, the one I wish someone had given me plainly, instead of the vague reassurance everyone defaults to. No, you're not going back to who you were before him. That specific person, the one with the specific blind spots that made her vulnerable to exactly that relationship, she's not coming back. And honestly, she shouldn't, because she was carrying vulnerabilities this relationship found and exploited. Going back to her would mean going back to the exact conditions that made this possible in the first place. But you are not disappearing into nothing either. You are becoming something Jung actually mapped decades before you were born, using a myth about an immortal healer who never lost his wound and became the greatest healer in mythology precisely because of it. Not despite it, because of it. The hypervigilance that scares you right now, some of it might be old, unprocessed fear that still needs tending, and that's worth being honest with yourself about. But some of it, if you're doing the real work, is turning into something else. Precision. The kind of perception that lets you notice in seconds what used to take you months to even suspect. That's not damage talking. That's the wound, finally being useful. I keep thinking about Chiron giving up his immortality at the end of that myth, trading away the one thing that made him unique, just to be free of the pain he'd carried so long. I used to think that ending was tragic. Now I think it's the most honest part of the whole story, because it means even the wounded healer doesn't have to carry it forever if he chooses release. But for as long as he did carry it, that wound was the entire reason his hands could heal what nobody else's could. And I think about that daughter's question again. Do you still have it? Or did you lose it when you left? I have an answer now, and it took me most of 2 years to find it. I didn't lose it. It changed shape. The version of me that could sit in a room with someone dying and know exactly what to say wasn't erased by the burnout or the divorce. It went quiet for a while, the way a wound goes quiet before you understand what it's actually teaching you. And when it came back, it wasn't the same instinct. It was sharper, more specific, tuned to things I couldn't have named before any of this happened. That's the whole answer. If you're waiting for one the way I was waiting in that parking lot, you're not losing the parts of you that mattered. They're recalibrating on a timeline that has nothing to do with how fast you want it to move. If any part of this resonated with you tonight, if you felt that specific, disorienting version of not knowing who you're becoming, I'd genuinely like to know. Writing something out here helps me as much as it seems to help the people who send me messages, like the ones I read at the start of this. If this channel means something to you, a super thanks goes directly toward the time it takes to read through Jung's actual writing, cross-reference it against real research like Tedeschi and Calhoun's work, and put it into words instead of repeating the same recycled advice everyone else does. You're not just a viewer to me at that point. You're someone helping keep this specific, careful kind of conversation alive, instead of the shallow version of it that's everywhere else. Before you go, I want to ask you something directly because I'm honestly not sure of the answer myself. Since you left, since whatever version of this happened to you, has there been a moment where you caught something instantly? A manipulation, a tactic, a pattern, something you would have completely missed a few years ago? Tell me about it in the comments. Not the abuse itself, the moment you noticed your own new perception working. Because I think that moment, whatever it looked like for you, is the actual proof of what we've been talking about this whole time. And I'd rather hear it from you than keep talking about it in theory. Sit with that for a moment if you need to. I'll be here when you're ready to talk about it.